We all know by now, obviously, what happened over the weekend at the UN. Winston Peters, as a representative of the New Zealand government, as a representative of all of us, decided to say that New Zealand was not yet ready to recognise the statehood of Palestine. I was lucky enough to be able, that was on Saturday mid-morning. I was lucky enough to grab Marama Davidson on Saturday early afternoon, I think, and we did a bit of a live stream together to talk about it. Heads up, Wednesday night we've got Debbie Narewa-Packer coming on, and she's going to be talking to us about that in particular as well and what it actually means, along with other news of the day, I guess. But tonight we want to welcome to the show the Leader of the Opposition, the Leader of the Labour Party. It is Chris Hipkins. Chris, good evening to you, sir, and welcome back.
G'day, thank you. Good to be back.
Good weekend? How was your weekend? Was it all right?
Yeah, not too bad actually. I'm in Auckland tonight, and I was up here over the weekend for the Moon Festival celebrations on Saturday, and may have popped into the rugby, which was certainly a better result than we had a couple of weeks back. So yeah, not a bad weekend overall.
I think what we'll do is, I mean, everyone knows the story, but just for the sake of the one person who's been living under a rock, let's just have a look. I cut a YouTube short with the announcement. Now, there was a 15-minute talk. There was 14 minutes of justification to then a 60-second soundbite by Mr. Peters as to what he has put forward to the world represents New Zealand. Let's just have a reminder of what that was.
And then, like over 150 countries before it, New Zealand's recognition of Palestinian statehood now would serve as little more than an existential act of defiance against an unalterable state of affairs. We are not ready to make that gesture. Rather, the New Zealand government believes that it has one opportunity to recognise Palestinian statehood, and it would make better sense to do so when conditions offer greater prospects for peace and negotiation than at present. With a war raging, Hamas still in place, and no clarity on next steps, we do not think that time is now.
So, thank you, Mr. Peters. Apparently on the world map, he's represented all of us New Zealanders by saying no. Did you have a heads up? Did you know what was coming? And if you didn't, what was your initial reaction?
No, we didn't get any briefing on this, unfortunately. I know a lot of people have described it as embarrassing, as I have myself, but I actually think it's worse than that. It is a shame on New Zealand. We've previously taken, as a country, a really principled position here. Murray McCully, who was a long-serving National Party Minister of Foreign Affairs, worked really hard through the Security Council and through New Zealand's position on the Security Council to try and achieve a two-state solution, which was based on the 1967 borders. That's going significantly further than anything that this current government have even contemplated. I think they've abrogated our principled, values-based position that's been, in place for decades under both Labour and National-led governments. And now we've gone from being, I think, one of the strongest voices in the world on this issue to one of the weakest. And I think that's just, it's left what was previously a very proud reputation internationally in tatters.
Why? Why do you think this is the call this government's made?
Well, it's hard to know. David Seymour clearly was going to block the government forming any kind of consensus-based decision on this.
Yeah.
That should not have stopped the government doing it anyway, particularly when they knew that they could reach across the aisle. They would have had support from Labour, they would have had support from the Greens. I'm not sure about Te Pāti Māori, but I think they would have supported it too. So there would have been a broad cross-party, cross-parliament consensus on the matter. But Christopher Luxon's too weak to reach out and do that. He's once again letting David Seymour and Winston Peters hold the government to ransom.
Ash, we haven't really talked to you much about this. You got any questions for Chris on this, or do you want to share any of your thoughts around what you, I saw something on your TikTok, but what you heard, what you thought when you heard the news?
Oh, sorry, you were, my reception seems to be really bad. Did you want to say that again? Sorry.
Just saying, if
The
you've got any
last part of the
questions for Chippy,
question.
or any questions for Chippy, or any comments you want to make about the decision at the UN as well.
Well, any questions at all? I think I have I have a million questions, but I think Chris has answered quite a lot of them. I personally am, quite embarrassed that this is the position that the government has taken, and I don't think a lot of people are surprised this is the position that the government's taken. Personally, I think when it comes to the Middle East, it's not uncommon for this to occur. When there's many, for example, my son's heritage, they're Assyrian, and so they're indigenous to Mesopotamia. Can someone find that on the map for me? You're not going to be able to find that. You're not going to be able to find these people in their own country anymore. And if we continue to allow genocides like this to occur, we will see this happen to countries like Palestine and peoples like Palestine, but they no longer have their land, they no longer have their rights, no longer have their culture and their nationality to grasp onto, and they're lost to history. That's my deep perspective on that. I've met a lot of refugees from a lot of nations, and to listen to their stories, and to have a minister such as Winston Peters, who would definitely have sat down and heard these stories, seen what war does, and to stand up there and just say, "Oh, not at this time." It's embarrassing and offensive.
Chris, we heard today that the documents that the government released along with this announcement said that they'd made the decision 3 weeks ago. What do you make of a decision being made 3 weeks ago and then them kind of spending 3 weeks going, well, I don't know, we'll have to wait. Well, I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. Come back after the ad break, we'll see if they get announced or not. It feels strange, like this was some kind of game and the winner was going to be announced or not at the UN, like it's an American Idol version of recognizing Palestine.
I mean, this is vintage Winston Peters. He does it when he's involved in government coalition negotiations. It's all about hogging the spotlight for as long as he can possibly get it. They made the decision. They clearly made the decision weeks ago and chose not to tell the New Zealand public what the decision was. And I think part of that is around media manipulation. The last thing Winston Peters wanted was his comments being reported on the international news with signs of people in New Zealand protesting against their own government's position. And by concealing it, by not allowing people to know what the government was going to be saying on behalf of all of us, they actually stopped New Zealanders being able to express their views in opposition to the position that our government has taken on our behalf.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, that they didn't want the embarrassment leading up to it. We keep getting told by Mr. Luxon, including of those 3 weeks where they had an answer, if not, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. He kept telling that for the past 3 weeks after they'd made the decision. And I guess we're all sitting back here of all of our politicians going, if not now, then when? What else needs to happen?
It's a great example of this government having its feet buried in concrete. That has been the position of a number of countries around the world until recently. When other countries have seen the unfolding genocide that's taking place in Gaza, they've decided to take a much more principled and a much stronger stance. And that includes our good friends in Australia, the UK, Canada. In fact, we are now in a small minority of countries around the world who haven't said that we will formally recognise Palestine as a state. The world has changed. That position that our government's articulating was the default position of a lot of countries that we typically would align ourselves with on these issues. It no longer is. And the fact that we're holding fast to a position when the rest of the world has moved on, the rest of the world has said, this is not principled, I think is an indictment on the government. As I said, we saw stronger representations on New Zealand's behalf by Murray McCully, the former National Party Foreign Affairs Minister, than we've seen from this current government.
There are some people who are saying, this should have happened 75 years ago. And I understand that that's an unrealistic thing to look back on. But it's inarguable that recognition of Palestine and their statehood could have happened any time in the past 75 years and hasn't. Obviously, October 7th, just at the end of your tenure, happened and you guys couldn't do anything then. But do you have any personal embarrassment for Labour not getting to this sooner? Do you hold any responsibility yourselves? Because this could have been, they could should have been recognised in 2020 or 2021 or 2022, and they haven't. So when you reflect on Labour's own efforts or non-efforts, how does it make you feel?
I started to look at this when I first became Prime Minister. I have to confess it's not an issue that I'd been deeply engaged with up until that point. But as we started the policy development process for 2023, for the election in 2023, this was something that I did have a good look at. And we had formulated the policy that it was time for New Zealand to take the next step and formally recognise Palestine as a state. Obviously, the terror attacks of Hamas in October kind of put the kibosh on us doing anything around that before the election.
Yeah.
I think what became apparent was that Israel's response to that, and I have been really clear all along, and I continue to hold the position, Israel had a right to defend itself against those attacks that they were subjected to in October. But what we've seen has gone well beyond any form of self-defense or any justified action in self-defense. Genocide is not a legitimate form of self-defense. Let's be clear about that. Starvation is not a legitimate form of self-defense. And I think the world is now calling that out, and New Zealand is not. And that's an indictment on New Zealand. You might remember after the election, I tried to strengthen New Zealand's position just on the very issue of the atrocities that were unfolding in the weeks following the Hamas attack on Israel, and was effectively stopped from doing that by the incoming government, because as a caretaker Prime Minister, I can only express views on behalf of the country if I have the agreement of the incoming government. I couldn't get it. So in the end, I ended up making a statement on behalf of the New Zealand Labour Party, who was the incoming opposition, because I couldn't get the incoming government to agree to take a stronger stance.
Well, they couldn't agree to who was going to do what at the end of that. I just want to make one thing clear, because I wasn't aware of this leading up to the election, although you did tell us last time as well, to your credit. So it was on October 7th that got you to change your perspective on the recognising of state, because it happened right at the very end. That was something you already come to before October the 7th and were running on into the last election.
Yeah, so the Labour Party had already signed off a policy position on that. We hadn't adopted that as a government position, though. We were in the process of looking at that and going through the sort of machinery of doing that. Obviously, that stopped when the October attacks happened.
Ash, you got a question for Chris? You want to get in there? I've got a few more, but do you have something you'd like to say and share? Did you get that, Ash? You're having some trouble with your connection there. We're wondering,
I do
Ash,
apologize. Yeah. Sorry. Try that again. You just popped back on my screen. Try that again.
Wondering if you've got a question for Chris.
I guess there's a lot of questions, and I don't sort of want to poke the bear a little bit. But I guess there's a lot of sentiment out in the public, and obviously specifically within our followers and stuff, in regards to obviously Israel's response to October 7th, for example, and obviously how you said that the retaliation is not proportionate. But in understanding that there is a perspective of, if had an incident such as this not occurred, so the genocide would have occurred anyway, and we just would have been none the wiser. In sort of those terms, and that's being the public sentiment. What is Labour's or your perspective in that regard? I guess it's a little bit of a tougher diplomatic question there, but yeah, just in that regard.
The Labour Party had made a decision that if re-elected to government, we'd be formally recognising Palestine after the election. Now, I have to be upfront, that in all likelihood would have still been after the election, not before the election, even taking aside October the 7th, which of course sort of stopped that process in its tracks for a period of time. It would likely have happened after the election. I think that it's the right thing for New Zealand to do. We would have done that fairly soon after the election, particularly when we saw how disproportionate the Israeli response to October the 7th was. October the 7th was atrocious, and there can be no, sympathy for that. But there can also be no sympathy for what Israel's doing now. And, I was raised on that basic value: two wrongs don't make a right. And what Israel's doing is far, far more serious, if anything. It is just wrong.
I think it's really important for us all to understand and remember that what you're saying is right, Chris, that what's happening now, is a genocide. But actually, I don't have the timeline in front of me, but on day 2 or October the 10th or October the 12th or whatever, when Israel bombed their first hospital or forced citizens to move south because they were about to bomb an apartment building, that was too far because they're war crimes, right? Under the Geneva Convention, so that's not defending yourself either. So I think it's really important that we all remember that it hasn't got to a point of being too far. Pretty much the first incursion that Israel went into Gaza to bomb a hospital or an apartment building, that was too far as well on day 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. At that point, we were days away from the New Zealand general election, and our eyes were sort of looking elsewhere at that point. But when asked about that at the time, I was already, even before the election, expressing real concerns about the proportionality of Israel's response. My concerns, of course, grew in the weeks following the election. Unfortunately, I wasn't in a position at that point, having lost the election, to do anything about that officially on behalf of New Zealand. And as I said, the incoming government weren't willing to just take it on at all.
I think it's really important for us to remember that whilst when people, not this is anyone in this shot right now, not us three, but when people kind of finally come to a conclusion of, oh yeah, now Israel's gone too far. It's like, no, they went too far the first day they bombed a hospital. That was too far. It's just taken you a while to catch up. Not so that you're not welcome now. Get yourself on the right side of history, but not to also go, oh, I guess about now is when they've pushed it one bar too far. But it's been going on for, if it's been 2 years, it's been going on for 1 month, 1 year, 11 months and 25 days. But it's been too far since then. You know what I'm saying?
And I think one of the things that makes, quite a few New Zealanders reluctant, or has made quite a few New Zealanders reluctant to criticise the Israeli government, is they don't want to be tarred with the label of anti-Semitism. And I think it's really important to be clear here that criticism of the Israeli government is not criticism of all Jewish people, any more than criticism of the American government is criticism of all Christian people. The reality here is there are a lot of Jewish people around the world who are quite horrified by what the Israeli government have been doing. And I do think it's important that we draw that distinction. Anti-Semitism is never acceptable. And it does trouble me that we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism in New Zealand as a result of this. It's not okay to be attacking Jewish people because of the actions of the Israeli government. It is absolutely legitimate to be very strong in our criticism of the actions of the Israeli government.
Just before we go on, Ash, I'm about to throw it back to you just so you can get ready for a question or a comment. But before we do, I didn't say this at the start of the segment, and I apologise, I always do. Your super chats are welcome. Making a super chat is no guarantee of it getting mentioned or asked while Chris is here. And regulars know that, but I just thought I should have said that at the start in case. I mean, we have a couple of super chats here, Chris, which I may throw at you, but we're not going to be able to do them all. So Ash, any more questions? I've got a couple of other things to talk to Chris about to do with job numbers and earthquake buildings. But do you have anything else before we move on from the Gaza conversation you want to ask Chris about or mention yourself?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. How do you feel that geopolitically this is going to reflect on us as a nation, like here in, as Aotearoa New Zealand? What are we going to look like now, outside of our usual alliances, now with a small number of nations going against the majority? How is that going to position us, and how does that look moving forward?
It is a real weakening of New Zealand's position. It's embarrassing for us as a country. It's I think a shameful position for New Zealand to be taking in an area where we previously were recognised as being a leader, a principled and valued leader. We're now seen as being totally on the wrong side of this argument. How that shakes out in terms of our standing on other issues internationally, it remains to be seen. But Winston Peters' speech, where he effectively attacked Australia, the UK and Canada, is something that we are likely to see some political repercussions for, even if it is just in the way those countries react and interact with us in the short term. I think we could expect a fairly frosty reception from some of those countries as a result of the comments Winston Peters has made, where he basically attacked them for the position that they have taken, which is a far, far more principled position than the New Zealand government's taken.
Right.
We had Bomber on Thursday night, and I did a bit of research on this. He had a look. Winston Peters voted against the legalisation of the Homosexuality Law Reform Act. He voted against same-sex marriage. It seems that every time a movement within history comes up to right or wrong or to fight for a human right in legislation, he's always on the wrong side of it. So if we had a thought about this prior to it, it kind of fits his MO that he's going to go nut. Because once again, Winston Peters and the New Zealand government are on the wrong side of history. It's when you think about where he's been, it's not quite as shocking to where he is today.
Winston Peters, politics are sort of trapped in the 1970s. They were forged during the time of Muldoonism, and that's about where his value system sits.
Spider Hoof has a question here. I'm going to ask you a couple of the questions, Chris, but Spider Hoof has a very important question to ask. Mr. Hipkins, can you personally pledge, I promise never to work with Winston Peters again, and I won't be eating sausage rolls on the campaign trail. Keep up the good fight, and I will be here supporting you all the way. So, serious question. I mean, I think Spider Hoof's joking a bit with both of them, but this always gets to you, ruling out people. I think the sausage roll one's probably more important, but do you want to respond to either of those or both?
I can respond to both. On the sausage roll front, I have to confess, I still like sausage rolls, but I've had to cut back a lot. I put on 10 kilos during the last election campaign, and I'm not kidding when I tell you I put on 10 kilos. I've managed to lose about 5 of them so far, but I've still got about 5 to go. School holidays last week wasn't good for the weight loss either. Spending time with the kids, generally involves dietary choices, which I later regret. So I can say that next election, I got into this trouble by saying before the last election that I really like sausage rolls, and so everywhere I went, people were serving me sausage rolls. So can I say this now? I'll say it exclusive to your show, and you can spread the word. I really like salads. Just when I'm out and about, I really, really like salads now. It's a new thing for me. But on Winston Peters, I said before the last election that Labour wouldn't work with Winston Peters had we been in a position to form government after the last election. And of course, we weren't in a position to form government after the last election. I can tell you there's not a day gone past since then that I have regretted that decision in any way. Because when I look at what this government, the shambles that this government has been in, the way Winston Peters and David Seymour have held the government to ransom, that's just not the style of politics that I'm interested in. I'm not interested in a style of politics which sees the smaller parties, whomever they are, trying to drive wedges between New Zealanders in order to carve out a share of vote. I don't think that's what politics should be about. It should be about bringing people together and solving problems together, rather than saying, well, I'm only interested in 5, 6, 7% of the vote, and I'll just carve people off in order to get that number, which is the modus operandi of particularly ACT and New Zealand First at the moment. So in terms of the next election, I think it's highly unlikely our position will change. The reason I haven't been more specific on that before now, and I'm not going to be absolutely specific until the next election, is as soon as I rule one party in or out, the question becomes, well, what about this party? What about that party? What about this policy? What about that policy? And I think those are things you do closer to the election.
And I think there was a bit of tongue-in-cheek there with Spider Hoof, but it's boring. It's just boring when the mainstream media do this. It's a little bit like, where is your policy? And then today the article comes out that National didn't release any of their policies until February of the year of the election, and they're all asking you to release some policy. It's just redonkulous. Hey, look, just a little.
National wants us to release policy so that they have something to attack, because they don't want to defend their own track record because it's so woeful.
Yeah.
And they really don't seem to have any ideas for how to turn the country around. Having said that they were the people who knew the numbers and knew the economy and were going to fix everything, they don't seem to have any answers.
Well, we'll get to that in a sec, if you've got a couple more minutes. But I'll just say this thing that I always say. This is why, Chris, because the left make policy and the right respond to policy. So they're not going to know what their response is until you guys put your policy out. So I'd leave it till about 3 days before the election, and you'll probably romp home. I'm kidding. Obviously, I joke. Hey, no, but just on that, on what you've just said, one little kind of tangent question, because what's obviously happened with this government is Luxon has sold his soul for a handful of beans, any means to an ends, right? This is what's happened. He is basically, we know this because the Treaty Principles Bill was not a bottom line for David Seymour. He's told us, yet Luxon folded to it because it's like, doesn't matter what you want, we'll give it to you, we'll give it to you. So he's gone down the path of any means to an end. Now, sometimes that means you've got to give away your morals, but there's always also that adage of, if we're not on the 9th floor of the beehive, then we can't affect the change. How do you personally decide kind of where you will give a bit to get a bit if it helps you get into government with any of the parties.
You still have to make compromises that are consistent with your values. So you can compromise on how you might give effect to them, the sorts of policies that you may or may not adopt. But I think doing things that are inconsistent with your values or not having any values at all, and it's debatable as to which position Christopher Luxon and his government and the National Party currently take, whether it's that they're willing to do things inconsistent with their values or whether they just don't have any. It's clear that they're letting Winston Peters and David Seymour run circles around them. I think we have some well-established principles around the sort of conduct that government ministers should be engaged in and should not be engaged in. Government ministers should not be attacking the judiciary. Government ministers should not be interfering in certain processes. And this government don't have any respect for that. And Christopher Luxon just won't do anything about it. So I've been very clear, and I think my own track record in the brief 8 months that I was Prime Minister actually speaks to this. When ministers don't uphold the standards that are required of ministers, then I will take action on that. And I'll be very clear, I will take action on that regardless of which party those ministers come from. You shouldn't get a free pass for bad behaviour or for doing things that are totally contrary to the ethical principles that ministers should sign up to, simply because you're from a smaller party.
Chris, I was going to ask you about the earthquake law changes for supporting buildings. I mean, we won't necessarily go there. It seems to be a bit of an insurance policy. It'll be fine if nothing happens, but if something happens, they will have horrible egg on their face that could end in more deaths. I see you taking a breath in. Maybe you were taking it more seriously than me. Would you like to share on that before I ask you my last question?
As with all things, the devil's always in the detail here. I do think that some of those regulations, and bearing in mind these were all regulations introduced by the last national government, the previous national government after the Canterbury earthquakes, and they were introduced for good reason because buildings literally collapsed where they shouldn't have. But some of them did go a bit too far, and so I think there is a reasonableness test that needs to be applied here. But as with everything, you've got to tread with care. This has got to be something that's got to be done based on evidence and detail and engineering advice, not based on what's going to make a good campaign slogan, because this should be good, solid, boring grunt work to get the details right. And we worked with the national government after the Canterbury earthquakes to come up with the regulations that are in place now. And we tried to offer them bipartisan support for that because we shouldn't politic about this stuff. People's lives depend on us getting this right. And the same principle applies here. I don't think there's any politics in this. I think it's really important that we get it right, because if we don't, we know what the consequences are. Buildings fall over and people die.
Yeah. All right. Look, just before, and thank you for giving us your time tonight. It's longer than we said it would be, as is always with us, Chippy. I'm sure you know that. You've done a release today, press release. National Economic Wrecking Ball cost 20,000 construction jobs. Christopher Luxon's economic mismanagement has cost 20,000 people their jobs in the construction sector. Job numbers out tonight or today. I'm sure the lovely Craig Rennie will be talking about that in his Locked Out podcast this week. But while we've got you here, you guys have done the press release. Do you want to quickly share your thoughts on these job numbers, especially the construction sector?
That shows how short-sighted the current government were when they came into office and just paused or cancelled or stopped a whole lot of stuff simply because it was the Labour Party or the Labour government that started it. It was petty and it was spiteful. And the reality is it's cost the economy dearly, and it's cost at least 20,000 jobs in construction. Although, to be fair, not all of that was public sector work. There's been a slowdown in private sector construction as well, but a good chunk of those jobs were previously public sector infrastructure and house build projects. So they cancelled a whole lot of Kainga Ora state house build projects. They did some really ridiculous things, like Chris Bishop, in his great wisdom, decided that he was this great negotiator who could get a better deal for some of the roading projects that the National Party had said that they wanted to do anyway. So in his own electorate of Hutt South, he put the Melling project on hold for the better part of 2 years. He's now claiming victory because they've turned the sod on the Melling interchange upgrade. They could have done that 2 years ago. He basically cost millions of dollars rather than saved millions of dollars. And now everybody's waiting for something. And in the meantime, those are jobs that were lost. They were people who didn't have work when they could have had work.
Just to wrap up, Ash, you kind of represent speak to a different audience than we do on TikTok and although we do okay on TikTok and on Facebook and stuff. From the feel of your viewers and listeners and the people who take your content, what do they want to ask Chris Hipkins, if it's anything else that we haven't covered so far?
Well, I didn't put the feeler out to ask.
in general.
Ask any questions. But I think in general, I think it would be definitely about the economy and moving forward. As you said, with a lot of people losing their jobs, people are feeling it hard. Is there a middle anymore kind of vibe, where everyone's doing tough? Those that could save no longer can save, and so it's just paycheck to paycheck and things like that. And with all these jobs losing, and I've also noticed and put out content myself about we're advertising for migrants to come in, which is great. I'm definitely not against anything like that myself. But when we're advertising for construction sector jobs where licensing and education could be done for our people to get them back to work right away, which we're not seeing, is that something we could look forward to? Or is there something that, perhaps in the future Labour or anyone could be bringing forward education and training to get these people back into work?
I think your question really highlights what I think is going to be one of the huge dividing lines in the next election campaign. Christopher Luxon and the current government want big, rich, international foreign investors to come in and save us. One of the messages from the Labour Party will be, we need to back ourselves here. We need to invest in ourselves. We need to upskill our people. We need to invest in our own businesses. We need to have the government out there actively helping to shape a competitive economy that works for all New Zealanders, not just for rich foreign investors. And I think that will be one of the big dividing lines in this coming election campaign next year. We need to get New Zealanders back to work. I'm far more interested in getting New Zealanders back to work so that they can get a good income, afford to buy their own house, access the public services they need, provide a good life for their kids, rather than line the pockets of wealthy foreign investors. And I think that is the dividing line in politics at the moment. The Labour Party's history has always been about working New Zealanders. It's in the name of the Labour Party. It's why the Labour Party was founded. It was founded on the notion that if you're out there creating the country's productive wealth, you should get your fair share of it. And far too many New Zealanders go to work every day, some of them working multiple jobs, and they feel like they're going backwards all of the time. That's not right. And we've been here before. It's actually why the Labour Party and the Labour movement was founded in the first place, because the world has gone through these cycles before where wealth has been captured by, a very small minority, and working people have missed out on their fair share of it. And we've got to kind of get back to those basic principles that hard work should pay off.
Yeah.
So you're saying pay equity is on the agenda?
Pay equity must be on the agenda. But I would also say pay parity, because those two things go hand in hand. And there's a really clear dividing line. If I, take something that I'm very passionate about, early childhood education, as Minister of Education, that was one of my highest priorities, was sorting out the mess that we've got in early childhood education. The fact that teachers in early childhood education working in the public sector, i.e. in kindergartens, are paid more than teachers working in the private part of the sector is just wrong, because they're doing the same job, they're doing the same work, they should be paid the same. But because they are largely dominated by women, those professions have been undervalued, and it's well and truly time we sorted that out.
Chris, it's been fabulous having you again. Appreciate you coming on, appreciate you being available. Peter has one other comment that we're going to put to you, which is an interesting one actually. Peter says, if it's Chippy's decision, it's more of a comment, he should buck tradition, refusing a knighthood for Luxon when he leaves office. He has no honour and shouldn't be given one. Any thoughts around Peter's point?
I'm very careful in making comments on that, because obviously as someone who hopes to be the Prime Minister, my advice goes directly to the King on those matters. And so you have to be a bit careful about what you say publicly about those things. But look, I take his broader point, but I obviously can't comment on the specifics of any particular nomination or future nomination.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much for giving us some time tonight. Always a pleasure. And I'm sure we'll be touching base again before the end of the year.
Good as gold. Great to talk to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. All the best.
Cheers.
Leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party, Chris Hipkins.